It was a crisp morning in the city, and the streets buzzed with the usual chaos, cars honking, people rushing to their jobs, and the city's hum of activity filling the air. But amidst all the noise, there was one sound that cut through everything. A child, no older than 5 or 6, stood alone near a trash can, crying uncontrollably. His small body shook as tears streamed down his face, and he pointed toward the can as if it held the answer to his pain. Passers-by ignored him, too busy with their own lives to even notice. But one man, a millionaire who had everything most people could ever dream of, couldn't turn away. His name was Richard. Successful, well-known, and living a life many would envy. He had made his fortune through years of hard work and smart investments. But the longer he lived in the fast-paced world of wealth and luxury, the more disconnected he felt from the things that truly mattered. In his world, money solved problems, and people often smiled around him because of it. But on this morning, everything was different. Something about the sight of the child's pain hit him deeply. He wasn't just a bystander anymore. He couldn't just ignore it. As Richard approached the child, he couldn't help but wonder what had brought him to this point. The boy's clothes were ragged, his shoes barely hanging onto his feet. He wasn't asking for anything, not for food or help, but the tears and the desperation in his eyes told a story that words couldn't express. The boy's tiny finger pointed toward the trash can, his sobs becoming more desperate with each passing second. Richard's curiosity and concern began to outweigh his usual aloofness. He had to know what was going on. With each step, Richard's heart pounded harder. He was a man of logic, of reason, but in this moment, there was nothing logical about the situation. He squatted down to the boy's level and gently asked, "Hey there, little one, what's wrong? Why are you crying?" The boy didn't respond. He simply continued pointing, tears still streaming down his face. Richard looked toward the trash can, but he couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. Just a pile of discarded wrappers and bottles, nothing that could explain the child's pain. Richard's mind raced. Was it something the boy had lost? Was he hungry? Or perhaps he was looking for something valuable that had been discarded? Richard tried to comfort him, offering a few words of reassurance. "It's okay, I'm here to help. We can figure this out together." But even his reassuring tone did nothing to calm the child. The boy's cries only grew louder, his small hands shaking as he pointed with more urgency. Richard's heart sank. He had seen a lot of things in his life: wealth, success, heartbreak, but nothing had ever shaken him like this. It was like the child was asking for help in a way that was impossible to understand, as if the boy knew something Richard couldn't see. The millionaire stood there for a moment, torn between his instinct to help and his growing confusion. His mind searched for a rational explanation. Was there something hidden in the trash that the boy was trying to point out? Was it possible that someone had left something of great importance, something the boy couldn't live without? As Richard stepped closer to the trash can, the boy suddenly stopped crying. The silence was almost more unnerving than the tears had been. The child's gaze shifted from the trash to Richard's face, locking eyes for a brief, intense moment. And then, without a word, the boy turned and ran, disappearing into the labyrinth of alleyways and side streets. Richard stood frozen, staring at the trash can, still unsure of what had just happened. The boy's cries had stopped, but now there was an eerie sense of finality in the air. What had the child been trying to show him? What was it that had caused such overwhelming emotion? Richard's mind raced, his thoughts spiraling. He was a man used to solving problems, finding answers, but this was different. The air seemed to grow heavier as Richard looked down at the trash can. He leaned closer, his curiosity outweighing the fear building in his chest. And that's when he saw it. Something that shouldn't have been there, something that made his heart skip a beat. But before he could reach for it, a voice echoed from behind him. "You shouldn't have looked in there." Richard turned around, startled. A woman, her face weathered by time and hardship, stood in the distance, watching him with a mixture of fear and warning in her eyes. She looked like someone who had seen far too much of the world's cruelty, someone who understood the darkness people tried to bury. The woman took a few steps forward, her voice low and urgent. "You don't know what you're dealing with. Leave it alone." Richard's heart raced as he tried to understand the gravity of her words. What was in the trash can? And why had the boy been so desperate, so lost in his own sorrow? More importantly, who was this woman? And what did she know about what had just happened? The millionaire found himself caught in a web of mystery, unsure of how deep it went or where it would lead. He had come looking for answers, but now it seemed like the questions were only multiplying. Richard's thoughts were interrupted when the woman spoke again, this time with a quieter, almost sorrowful tone. "There are things in this world you're not meant to see, Richard. Sometimes it's better not to ask." The words hung in the air like a dark cloud. Richard stood there, frozen in place, as the woman's shadow grew longer and the city around him continued on, oblivious to the quiet storm unfolding. What was the boy pointing to? Why had he been crying so uncontrollably? And who was this woman who seemed to know more than she let on? As the mystery deepened, Richard knew one thing for sure. His life was about to change in a way he couldn't possibly predict. But for now, he stood on the edge of a revelation, unsure whether he should dive deeper or turn away before it was too late. The only thing he could do was follow the thread, no matter how tangled or dangerous it might become. And that was just the beginning. Richard couldn't shake the woman's words. "There are things in this world you're not meant to see." They echoed in his mind, pulling at him, making him question everything. What was so dangerous about what he had seen? What was in that trash can that made it so important? And why had the boy been so desperate to show him? Richard was a man who thrived on answers, but this was different. There was no immediate solution, no simple equation to solve. As the days passed, Richard found himself fixated on that moment. His work seemed distant, irrelevant, as his thoughts kept returning to the child and the trash can. He couldn't focus on the meetings, the deals, or the press conferences. His mind was consumed with one question: what was hidden in that trash? He had tried to forget about it. He tried to ignore the way the child's eyes had locked with his, filled with pain and fear. But the more he tried to brush it off, the more the feeling lingered, gnawing at him. The truth was, Richard wasn't just a millionaire businessman. He was a man who had become numb to the world, insulated by wealth and status. But that boy had made him feel something again, something real, something he couldn't just ignore. The first thing Richard did was return to the area. It wasn't easy. His reputation and schedule were obstacles he didn't take lightly. But something deep inside told him he couldn't let this go. The street where he had seen the boy was quieter now, more desolate. He walked up to the spot where the trash can had been, half expecting it to be gone, as if the entire encounter had been a figment of his imagination. But the trash can was still there. Richard stood over it, his breath caught in his chest. He couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. People had walked past this place every day without a second thought. But now for Richard, it felt like the center of something much larger. He had come here to find answers, but what he found was something far darker. He reached for the edge of the trash can, his hand trembling. As he pulled it open, the smell hit him first, sharp, metallic, a stench that made his stomach twist. But it wasn't just the smell that disturbed him. It was the sight of what lay inside. It wasn't garbage, not in the way he had expected. There were items piled together, old worn-out clothing, newspapers, empty bottles. But beneath them, tucked away like a hidden secret, was a small battered notebook. Richard's heart raced. He reached for it, his fingers brushing against the fragile pages. The notebook felt strangely heavy in his hands, as if it held a weight far beyond its physical appearance. His fingers trembled as he opened it. The pages were filled with scribbled drawings, crude but full of emotion. The drawings depicted scenes of a family, happy at first, then slowly descending into chaos. A mother holding a child's hand, both of them looking over their shoulders in fear. A man, dark-eyed and faceless, standing in the background with a threatening presence. There were words, too, scattered across the pages, fragments of sentences that didn't make sense. But they all had one thing in common: fear. Richard's mind raced as he turned the pages, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Who had drawn these? Why was this notebook hidden in the trash? And why had the boy been so desperate to show it to him? As he looked deeper into the notebook, a name stood out. It was written in bold, shaky letters, Lena. Richard frowned. It was a name he had never seen before, but something about it felt familiar, as if it had been floating in the back of his mind for a long time. Lena. The name reverberated in his thoughts, like a key unlocking a door he didn't know existed. That's when he heard it. A soft voice behind him, low and strained. You shouldn't have looked. Richard spun around, his heart racing. It was the woman again, standing just a few feet away. Her expression was no longer one of warning, but of something else, something darker. Her eyes were filled with a mix of sadness and resignation. You don't understand, do you? She asked, her voice trembling. Richard's chest tightened. Who are you? What is all this? Who's Lena? The woman didn't answer right away. She took a step closer, her eyes never leaving the notebook in Richard's hands. Then, almost as if she had no choice, she spoke. Lena was the boy's sister. She disappeared when they were just children. No one knew what happened to her, but the family was never the same after that. The boy, his name is Caleb. He's been looking for her ever since. The notebook, it's all he has left of her. All he has to remember her by. Richard's stomach churned. He had thought the boy's tears were about hunger or loss. But this was something far deeper. Caleb's pain wasn't just about being hungry or abandoned. It was about losing someone he loved, someone who had been taken from him. But why? Why would he point at the trash? Richard asked, his voice strained. What was in the notebook that he needed me to see? The woman's face grew darker. The notebook holds the key to what happened to Lena. There's something in there, something that the world isn't ready to know. And Caleb, he's been trying to find her for years. He believes that if he can get the right person to look at the notebook, to understand the truth, he can finally bring her back. Richard's breath caught. Bring her back? But she's gone, isn't she? The woman nodded grimly. Yes, but not in the way you think. The weight of her words hit Richard like a physical blow. He had uncovered more than he ever expected, but now he was tangled in a mystery that went far beyond anything he had ever imagined. Caleb's story was only the beginning, and the deeper he went, the more he realized that the truth he was chasing might be far more dangerous than he could ever have prepared for. Richard looked down at the notebook, now understanding that it wasn't just a record of a child's grief. It was a map, a trail leading somewhere dark, somewhere hidden. And as the tension between him and the woman grew, he realized that the deeper he dug into this mystery, the more he would risk losing himself. But the question was no longer if he would get involved. The question was whether he could handle the truth once he found it. And that truth, whatever it was still waiting to be uncovered. Richard's heart pounded in his chest as the weight of the woman's words sank in. Bring her back. It felt impossible. Lena was gone. There was no bringing her back. People didn't come back from the dead. But as the woman's eyes fixed on him with a quiet, almost desperate intensity, something inside Richard shifted. He realized that this wasn't just some tragic story about a lost child. This was something far more complicated, something that connected him to a world he never even knew existed. The woman, whose name Richard now learned was Ruth, took a long, shaky breath and stepped closer to him. The boy isn't just trying to find her. He's trying to undo what was done, she whispered. Lena didn't just disappear. She was taken, and not by anyone you could ever imagine. If Caleb can piece together the truth in that notebook, he believes he can bring her back, not in the way you think. But there's a price to pay for meddling with things that should stay buried. Richard's mind raced, the pieces slowly starting to fall into place. Lena hadn't simply vanished. She had been taken, and Caleb, in his desperation, had been searching for a way to bring her back, even if it meant risking everything. Ruth continued, "You need to understand, Richard. This isn't just about a child's grief or a tragic story. It's about something far darker, something that connects people, places, and events in ways you can't begin to comprehend." She looked at him, her gaze unwavering. Caleb believed that if the right person saw the truth in the notebook, if they understood the past, they could change the course of what happened. Richard shook his head, trying to process everything. But how? How could looking at a notebook change the past? And what's so dangerous about it? Ruth hesitated before answering, her voice low. Because the truth isn't something people are meant to know. There are forces out there, forces that have been manipulating this city for decades. They have the power to bend time, to warp memories. They've been hiding behind masks for years, and they don't want anyone discovering the truth. Caleb thought if he could find someone willing to see things through his eyes, willing to believe, he could turn back time, change the moment Lena was taken. Richard's mind reeled. Bend time, warp memories. It was beyond anything he could have imagined. Yet something inside him told him this wasn't just madness. Something deep within the bones of the city had been whispering at him all along. It wasn't just about a missing girl. It was about a hidden power, a force that Richard had never understood or even seen coming. Ruth's next words hit him like a lightning bolt. "That notebook you're holding, it's the key to unlocking it all. If Caleb finds someone who believes, someone willing to risk everything, then he might just have the chance to change things. But there's a price. Every time someone tries to change the past, it comes with a cost. A sacrifice." Richard's blood ran cold. A sacrifice. What could possibly be worth risking everything for? And who would have to pay? Before he could ask another question, Ruth stepped back, her eyes clouded with emotion. "Caleb is waiting for you, Richard. He's been waiting for someone like you. But the decision you make now will change everything. You can't turn back." Richard glanced at the notebook in his hand. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He thought of his life, the luxuries, the success, the endless comforts, and suddenly they all seemed trivial. None of it mattered anymore, not in the face of what he was holding. He turned toward Ruth, his voice steady. "Where is he? Where's Caleb?" Ruth nodded toward an old, abandoned warehouse near the edge of the city, an area Richard had always avoided. "He'll be there. But be warned, Richard. Once you step in, you might not be able to walk out the same way." Richard didn't hesitate. He knew what he had to do. He had to face whatever truth was waiting for him, no matter the cost. As he made his way to the warehouse, the city around him felt different, heavier, almost as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The streets seemed quieter, the buildings looming over him as he approached the entrance. Inside the warehouse, Caleb was waiting. His small figure was barely visible in the shadows. His eyes locked on Richard with an intensity that took his breath away. He didn't say a word as Richard stepped closer, but Caleb's gaze told him everything he needed to know. This was it, the moment of truth. Without another word, Caleb held out his hand, as if offering Richard a chance to change the course of their lives forever. Richard could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him, but he knew there was no turning back now. He had come this far, and he couldn't just walk away. With a deep breath, Richard reached out and took Caleb's hand. In that instant, everything changed. The world seemed to tilt, and Richard felt a rush of memories. Memories of things he had never lived, things he had never seen. The past began to unravel before his eyes, and he understood what had happened to Lena, what had happened to the boy he was holding hands with. He could see it all, the people who had taken her, the forces that had manipulated them, the darkness that had held them in its grip. But with that knowledge came a price. Richard could feel himself slipping away, his connection to reality thinning. He was losing something, something important. The price of changing the past was never easy, and it was taking its toll on him. As Richard stood there, overwhelmed by the truth he had just uncovered, Caleb looked up at him, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. "You did it." But Richard knew something was wrong. The moment they had changed the past, everything had shifted. Caleb was no longer the boy he had met days ago. Something was different about him, something older. Caleb had made the ultimate sacrifice to bring Lena back. But in doing so, something precious had been lost. Richard felt a wave of sadness wash over him, realizing that, in the end, not all sacrifices could be reversed. The past had been rewritten, but at what cost? The final twist came when Richard looked at the doorway to the warehouse. There, standing in the shadows, was Lena, alive, but not quite the same. She wasn't the girl who had disappeared all those years ago. She was changed, older, as if the very act of being brought back had altered her. In the end, the price of changing the past was more than Richard could have ever imagined. The world had shifted, and as he watched Lena and Caleb together, he understood that not all questions had clear answers. Not all truths had simple resolutions. Richard had changed too, and whatever future awaited them all was now uncertain. But one thing was clear. Some stories were never meant to be rewritten, and some secrets, once uncovered, could never be forgotten. As they walked away into the unknown, the city behind them seemed to hold its breath once more.